Welcome back to another huge family conversations within kind of the realm of education and social political kind of themes. Last call that we had, Christian, we started to dive in a little bit more into cynical theories and specifically uh, kind of postmodernism, how they frame it, and then into more specifics, the actual theories themselves, or the theory that the components that make up theory. And we had talked about post-colonialism, and this week we're going to dive into a little bit more of race and intersectionality, and there'll definitely be more to come, and this will be kind of a good leeway into some of those other ideas. But I won't, let's just kind of dive in with race intersectionality. What are your thoughts kind of to get us rolling?
Well, first, to anybody that ends up watching this, sorry that my camera's a disaster and I can't figure out the lighting. So, yeah, I
All
haven't had
right.
that before. Tech savvy, this guy. I think, well, there's a few things that I'm hoping might. I gotta move this. It didn't shut off. Just, I mean, I guess as a reminder, we're reading the Cynical Theories book. I think you said that.
Hmm.
I really like Lindsay. I like Pluckrose. I think they did a really nice job. Um, so yeah, we've talked about kind of on this map of where we're going. So we've talked about theory. We talked about postmodernism and the collision that it was on in the early 1900s, and we've moved into applied postmodernism, essentially the radicalizing or the activism side. Instead of just rejecting everything, we're rejecting very particular, specific things and allowing us to um, kind of proscribe what things ought to be, how things ought to be. So, race is an interesting one that fits in with this. I think we're going to do a few things. I like when we set the roadmap and then talk about what we're going to do and then actually start to break it down. So I
Yeah.
wrote down some stuff. We're going to break it into two parts, I think is ultimately the best way to go about it. We're going to start with race and cover a lot of that today. What is it? Where did it come from? We're going to talk about social constructs. We're going to talk about the framework um, that took us from kind of the end of the slavery era in the 1860s. And then we're going to talk about the 14th Amendment, the 13th and 14th Amendment. We'll fast forward to the civil rights era, the movements there, and then we'll talk about how we're ultimately the activist side is moving away from this universal type of equality principle and moving more towards again a prescribing of how we ought to view people more as groups or classes rather than individuals. And I think the authors do a really nice job kind of identifying why that's bad, why it's a move away from what it has been and why that's bad. Intersectionality, the next time we get into this, I really don't think intersectionality is too hard to figure out or pick up on. Maybe that's not true. Maybe I'm missing a lot of it. But I think that in order to understand intersectionality, you have to understand the framework with race because that's really what led those scholars to kind of pick up and expand into that realm a little bit more. Just to, preview of coming attractions. I mean, intersectionality is just the collision between when you have multiple different characteristics. Effectively, how do you balance and determine how you ought to move forward or help individuals that are at these intersections of different pieces, where you're no longer white and male and Christian, but what if you're disabled, black, and gay? What if you're disabled, black, and not gay? What if you're disabled, Hispanic and gay? It's essentially trying to figure out a really complex framework of navigating that. But that's for later. That's just preview of coming attractions. So um, let me see. Did I miss anything? I don't think so. Um, okay. Any anything to add before I
No,
shift
no, yeah.
gears?
Let's
Okay.
dive in. Let's kind of go back into the history.
Okay. So again, the way I try to think about just about everything. We have these authors that are saying, well, this is what's happening and it's bad. And that's oversimplifying what they're doing. But in order to understand why it's bad and this movement, we have to understand what the baseline was or the framework originally. And I think that just evaluating the history is a good way to do that. So, um, I mean, we're dealing with race. I'm not going to go back through every aspect of slavery, every aspect of um, the civil rights era. I think most people probably have taken American history or some equivalent and are familiar with that stuff. If needed or if you want to, we could go into more depth another time. But I think we can kind of gloss over a lot of this and get to the points that I think are critical right here. Um, can you see me okay? The
Yeah,
light
fine.
acting
No,
funny.
you're
Okay.
fine.
Um, but I there are a few points I want to make. So this is really interesting. Being in law school, I mean, we hear about CRT, critical race theory, all the time. That I haven't heard as much about it outside of school in the last 2 or 3 years as I did maybe 5 years ago. Um, I think it's becoming less prevalent, but it's still out there. And so, kind of understanding what is critical race theory. I think to do that, I guess I already said that. We got to go back through kind of the history and how this unfolded. So, oh, 1865, I think, is when the 13th Amendment was passed, right? So,
Yep.
for a long time, culturally and economically, slaves were a big part of, the American founding. So, the colonial era, that came to an end. Obviously, I mean, the Civil War, slavery played a part in that, along with, a bunch of other things. But we get the 13th Amendment that's passed, and we're going to talk about amendments and what they are in a minute. But ultimately, we get to the point where the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery and prohibits involuntary servitude. Shortly thereafter, 2 or 3 years later, I think it was 68, we get the 14th Amendment. And when you talk about generally the 14th Amendment, there's two really important parts. You have the Equal Protection Clause and you have the Substantive Due Process Clause, allegedly. That's debatable in a lot of spheres, what substantive due process should look like. But equal protection is really what we're focused on. 14th Amendment was really supposed to, at least one argument is it's supposed to take those former slaves and elevate them back to what essentially the standing of white people. The 13th Amendment is, you can't have slaves anymore, but that doesn't mean that the institutions, the people, the culture is recognizing former slaves as the same as white people. It's okay, we can't own you anymore. It doesn't mean you're the same as me.
Right.
I think is one of um, the mainstream kind of themes that you see running in that time. You see it in the case law, you see it in some of the legislative history. So that's important. And the reason I bring up those two, one is well, it hits the nail right on the head, but two, in CRT, when we start to dive into this a little bit deeper, Derek Bell, kind of the founder of it, is a Harvard law professor. I think he was the first Black tenured law professor at Harvard. And then you get Kimberly Crenshaw that comes later that is really kind of the founder of intersectionality. So it's this interesting collision between politics and law. It's not just a political or social theory or phenomenon that we see going on. It's the law did something and now it's changed and there's a lot of feeling, there's a lot of what's the word, thoughts and movement around kind of what's going on. And there's more to this puzzle, but this is why I'm going to kind of harp a lot on the legal aspect because really I think at its core, this is a legal issue. So amendment, I'm sure you're familiar with amendments. Essentially it's a change to the Constitution. So my kids that are watching this one day, I'm sure I can bore you to tears with more of this later, but amendment. So we've changed the Constitution, the big document that runs, the federal government. And when we decide that is the supreme law of the land. So if anything is in violation of that, it is going to be struck down. So we have decided, the states decided at that point that slavery was unlawful Well, not unlawful. It was no longer accepted, and in order to memorialize that, it adopted or ratified a new amendment to the Constitution. And then, in order to give effect to that amendment, the states passed another amendment, the 14th Amendment, in order to really carry that out. I said give effect, but essentially to give the 13th Amendment teeth, in order to be able to actually do something about it. And then later on, we skipping ahead 100 years, we get to the civil rights movement. You're familiar with that? I think most people are. But essentially, I think at that point, we see this change in people are recognizing, okay, we have to provide equal protection of the law. That's true. But what about in things like employment, public accommodations, restaurants, being on the bus? Employment's obvious. We know what that looks like. Um, Couple other, I had a few points I wanted to make. Um, oh, housing and zoning regulations. So we have a statute. Congress passes a statute, and maybe are you familiar with this? Civil Rights Act
Yeah,
1964.
yeah,
Okay. So there's a couple important pieces that come out of that. You get Title II. There's a bunch of titles. You get Title II, and I don't want to butcher this. I want to make sure I get this right. Title II, public accommodations. I mentioned that. That's federal funding, so you can't discriminate in federal funding instances. Um, I think that one it probably is less prevalent than the next two that we talk about a little more frequently. Um, you get Title VI and you have Title VII as well. Oh, I screwed it up. I said public accommodation. That's Title II. Title VI is the one that's less common. That's federal funding, and Title VII is employment. So um, structurally, we've got the Constitution at the top, and then we have a congressional level or a federal level statute that applies to everybody. And then shortly thereafter, almost I think every state adopted some form of anti-discrimination policies or statutes, within the states. And the reason I point that out is one, the language doesn't always match, but two, there's a few different ways that the government is targeting this. One, putting the Constitution aside, but you have the federal government saying within the federal stuff, we are not allowing discrimination. But there are certain aspects of government where the state is the one that's in charge of that, where it might, if it's not receiving federal funding, potentially, maybe there's an argument, maybe not. But there might be some instances where, well, we don't have to necessarily follow this federal statute. Also, I don't, I'm going to have to review, but I think the Fed, like Title VII, I think only applies to employers that have 15 or more employees. So if you're under 10, it's like, well, so are we allowed to discriminate then? Can we
right.
can we do that? Well, you'd have to look at the state statute, the state structure in order to see what the qualification or what the requirements are there. So there's a lot of moving pieces legally, and then you have all the case law that's involved in as well. And case law meaning what the judges have decided. So the judges hear cases, they pass a ruling or they write an order, have a holding, and then that applies and that becomes the law too. So we've got some Plessy v. Ferguson's in the background over here, Brown v. Boards in the background over here. Maybe you're familiar with those, but Plessy is separate but equal, which is no longer the case. It's no longer the rule. And then you have public school integration. So there's a lot of, I mean, this is old news to you, but there's racial tension
Right.
that's going on for, I mean, hundreds of years here. I think largely it's gone. And we're talking about something else currently, but you can see structurally, well, not structurally, but pattern. No, that's still the wrong way. You can see how things have unfurled and led to some race issues. I think to undersell that point. um, any questions? I'm kind of just going off.
And no, and I think you're kind of addressing the very um, kind of the main points in history. And I think the important thing in anyone, again, to your point, who's studied this should know, all of these things are taking place because of the, if you will, the feeling in the emotion of the American people at the time. I mean, if people just understood the 13th and 14th Amendment for what they were and treated them as they're stated, meaning everyone's equal. We're just going to make that a kind of a blanket statement, then we wouldn't have to get into it, wouldn't become this nitty-gritty thing. But there was, I mean, there was a legitimate, um, I guess, call for people being racist at the time, and that wasn't unreasonable, and that was a very real thing, to your point, for that, for the hundreds of years, the 250 years of our country's founding, for that first, especially 150 years. I mean, racism was economic. And then the last
Yep.
100 years, it's kind of been like, well, we've got a racism is a lot more complicated because now it's, people are equal, people based on the law, which, I mean, again, it sounds kind of silly just saying that, but that's because we live in it. We live in a time when we don't know anything different, where it's designed that way. It's supposed to be that way. Sure, yeah, that makes sense. Being religious as well. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But it's also important to recognize it's not how it was in this era that we're talking about. And so also, it makes sense why all of these things are going on. And in the whilst all of that's happening, there's so much emotion, there's so much tension, there's so much strife from this push and pull of these two groups of whether it's black activists or white activists or whatever color your skin is, trying to either get more access to opportunity or suppress access to opportunity. It doesn't matter which side you are. And the government's trying to mitigate this in a good way. And in a lot of senses, I think it's a good job. And that then comes the real difficult part of actually having it be implemented in large scale amongst the actual people, if that makes sense. So I'm saying beyond what you're saying, there's a lot of things happening in the background, and I think
Oh
just
yeah.
acknowledging that is significant.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot going on. So to add a few points to this, so your point of, well, here, I guess the question is, could we, if everybody had just hopped on board with the 13th and 14th Amendment, would we have needed the Civil Rights Act? Well, we have to talk about where the coverage actually applies, and who's bound by it. So the Constitution applies to the federal government. These are our protections that are guaranteed against the feds. So the 13th and 14th Amendment, if there's no, let me back up. Then you have the Fifth Amendment, which allows, based on judicial interpretation, the Bill of Rights and the amendments to be applied against the state governments. So what, in effect, what that means is these don't apply, these amendments don't apply you and me as against you versus me just in ordinary life. You can't come to me and say you can't do that because the 13th Amendment provides no involuntary servitude. There's no there's no cause of action as the fancy legal term. There's no ability for you to pursue that argument in court because I'm not the government and you're not the government, right?
Sure.
So it's interesting that when you actually start to pursue or pursue what we call a remedy, what are you actually after? What are you trying to get? I think generally with the distinction is it requires, in order to pursue a violation of this, you have to have some kind of state action. So we have the state that's doing something, you have the federal government doing something, a local government doing something. But that is way more nuanced than we have to get into. That's constitutional law. So I'm going to kind of push that to the side. So the reason we have the Civil Rights Act is it allows, we have application to the individuals. So Congress decided, nope, business owners, you can't treat people a certain way or discriminate against them because of their skin color, their sex, their national origin, etc. So pursuing a remedy there, you can take that into court and say, hey, that employer discriminated against me because of my skin color. And the court can say, okay, well, let's see if you can prove it. And then there might be some kind of, monetary compensation or some other kind of, declaration of having your rights violated. So both are necessary. They serve different functions. That's a crash course in like three different areas of con law, employment discrimination. So anyway, we can kind of push that to the side. Let's talk about the purpose. And I think this is important. And it's something in my classes right now that I'm thinking about and we talk about. The purpose of the amendments and the Civil Rights Act. I think there's a good argument that those were designed to eliminate intentional discrimination, specifically in this context, racial discrimination. We haven't defined that word yet, though. I want to come back to that. We're going to define race in a minute and figure out what exactly it is. But it's interesting that as we talk about, we're gonna get there. I keep kind of alluding to it without hitting it right on the head. This principle of equality. I think the amendments and the Civil Rights Act were designed to produce equality under the law for individuals. So you have people being treated equally by the law. I don't think these were designed to reduce or get rid of unintentional discrimination or any type of systemic discrimination, if you believe in that, such a concept. That's the way that the statute reads, the way it's been interpreted, the way I think logically it applies. We're trying to root out bad actors doing bad things, right? ABC company discriminating against Hispanic applicants because they don't like Hispanics. That's what we're trying to get at.
Right.
I don't think it's anything that's unintentional or has kind of an unintentional impact or unintentional consequence. So that's complicated stuff. Again, I want to push that to the side. Getting a little too deep into the legal realm.
Yeah.
Did that make sense?
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Okay. Sorry, it was a little long-winded.
You're good.
So I don't think, to kind of shift gears, we're not trying to eliminate all types of inequality, just the intentional ones. So this is tying this back into the book. I think the book does a nice job talking about universal, I think they call it universalism, this universal principle of justice or fairness or equality. People ought to be treated equally under the law. And I think that is the system we live in. But there are some people that go, okay, we have these amendments, we have these statutes, federally and state, and we have, all sorts of other rules and regulations that are designed to help eliminate this type of discrimination. Yet I still see an inequality. I still see, maybe some discrimination unintentionally happening. And if this was the solution, why isn't it taking care of those things? Well, I think it's a legitimate question.
Sure.
I think we can ask that. Now, whether they can prove that it actually is occurring is a different question, but that's more of a structural argument. They're ultimately, I think the book outlines, it's moving to this structuralist argument that, well, the system is broken, the system needs to be repaired because although we've implemented these good things, these neutral policies, we're still getting unequal, disparate kind of results, and we tend to think that they're based on race. So I think that's kind of foreshadowing maybe the argument that's going to come up. I don't really want to get into it yet, but that I think is ultimately what Derek Bell is going to be advocating for. So again, review of coming attractions. So are you good? Vocabulary. Yeah. Can I shift gears?
Let's do it.
Oh man. So we got to define, I really hadn't thought about this until I sat down to kind of prep this. But race, what is race? What is race? There's a few definitions on here. I know you've got the list too, but in my head I was going, well, it's your skin color. This shouldn't be hard. It should be 2 words, skin color. That's your race. Well, I think it might not be the case. So a couple, here's Britannica's. I think it had one that I liked. It's a social construct used to categorize people into groups based on shared, often visible, physical traits like skin color, hair texture, facial features. It's a system historically created to establish social hierarchies rather than a valid biological division of the human species. ChatGPT says, race is a categorization of people based on perceived physical traits, such as skin color and facial features. And so I'm going, huh, social construct is interesting. They say that there. We need to define what that means. But so nowhere in here is it talking about like your DNA, your biology, the thing that makes us up. Um, Maybe that's is obvious to you. It wasn't obvious to me. It was like, oh well, some people are born and based on, where you're from, your lineage, you might have a different skin color. That's in your DNA. Well, not necessarily. And it might even be broader than that. So I thought that was interesting. So social construct, Merriam-Webster. A social construct is an idea, concept, or meaning created and accepted by people in society rather than existing inherently in nature. These constructs include things such as money, time. This says gender. Gender needs to be distinguished from sex. That's a different talk that we'll get into. But these are shaped by social, cultural, and historical forces, acting as taken for granted realities that can change over time. Well, for me, it certainly was taken for granted. I thought that this was just how it is. And I think that's not true. Biologically, I don't think there's a difference in the races. It's male and female. If you are a male, you have certain DNA, and female, you have certain DNA. Your lineage, you get certain DNA. But race, I don't think, as it says, is something that naturally occurs. What does it say? I don't want to butcher it. Um, Rather than existing inherently in nature. So I think that's quite interesting. And you might be like, where are you going with this? But I think that possibly it, I think this is an important piece because this is something that if it's actually just something that we've perceived and created, then we ought to be able to just reduce or eliminate seeing color. And I think this is getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I think that ultimately, if you believe in advocating for justice before the law or equality under the law, I think maybe color blindness is a requirement because there is no legitimate difference between people based on skin color. So the law should provide equality to everybody, regardless of race. And I think that the amendments and the Civil Rights Act did a nice job getting at that. Whereas if you start to organize people into groups, now you're socially constructing classifications based on something that might not have an inherent value. So that you see why when we were off camera, I was like, this stuff it takes time because it's so complex. I
Yeah.
mean, even just defining what race means, and we have this entire chapter to like break down how it's been playing out. Well, we got to understand what it is. So, any thoughts?
Uh, yes, this idea, I mean, social construct comes up a lot in the book, and it
Yep.
comes up a lot whenever we talk about theory, postmodernism.
Uh-huh.
Oh, not Siri, sorry. Um, and she's listening always. But
Always.
um, and it's interesting because it comes back to kind of the idea that I remember, a handful of videos ago, and we talked about postmodernism, that it is designed to be ironic. It is designed to be confusing. It is intentionally, you use the word slippery.
Yep.
And social construct, even just the word feels it feels icky to even try and define, try to explain because it's so, I mean, in a lot of senses, it's kind of contrary to tradition. Like it's like, no, we're we're going to even take the ideas of how people want to use the term equality, and yet everything is a social construct which eliminates equality and divides people into groups, kind of like you're saying. And so there's no universal. Everything's based on the group and the particular construct that you fit within. And it's something, it's I could relate if someone watching this is going, I'm not really grasping it.
Okay,
I
well, you
can
need to say that. That's good. Okay.
no, and I'm not saying it because
Oh,
not because I don't understand. it's
Okay.
because I think it is a hard thing to
It's hard.
understand.
Yes.
And not it, right, because everything you've said makes sense. But
Sure.
even as we go through it, I'm having here to like use some brain power to go, okay, I know where we're going with this, right? Someone else, when we're going to get to intersectionality, we're going to get to queer theory, and we're going to get to fat studies, and we're going to get to some of these other ideas. I know social construct fits into all of these things, and it's almost like it's kind of a foundational principle in a sense, even though not a defined principle, but it is a very foundational thing to everything theory, to everything kind of social justice and whatnot. And so what I'm trying to say is if someone else is confused, that's okay.
Yeah.
It is
Let,
confusing. It is
so
hard. Go ahead.
let's flesh out. Yeah, yeah. Now, so you're saying this, and in my head, I'm going, okay, yeah, social construct probably needs a little more time. And for me, I just took it for granted because I've been hearing it for so long. But yeah, and it is interesting. I mean, one of my criticisms generally of applied postmodernism is they like to allege that objective truth is actually just a construct. And if it's a construct, it can be changed. And if it can be changed, then that means whoever's in charge and has power gets to determine what it means. And here I am saying, well, race is a construct. So why am I not guilty of doing the thing that I'm alleging is a bad thing? Well, I think that one of the reasons, and maybe the primary reason, and I'm gonna have to think more about this, um, but if we look in nature, um, and let me explain what I mean by that. If you were to eliminate the government and order and society, would race matter? If we took away, if it was just us out in the middle of nowhere fighting for survival, trying to do anything, just in the state of nature, is race something that would be an objective factor that would make a difference, or would well, I'll ask you that question. I've got my answer, and it's not
I
guess what I'm thinking,
Yeah,
but
no, I think if we're going based on purely nature, I don't think so. I think it's going to be,
yeah, I think that's right.
I think it's a merit. It becomes a meritocracy again. It's like, can you add value? Can
So
you
so
not?
put away any sense of like organizing into groups. I mean,
Sure,
you are out just with a spear in your hand trying to kill stuff and just stay alive. I think the factors that are going to matter more is how strong are you?
sure.
How
Yeah,
fast are you?
right.
What your actual biology, are you male or female? Can you reproduce? The actual biological factors, I think, have legitimacy to them. Your skin color probably does not. Your facial features probably do not. Your hair color probably not. So I think in that concept, what I'm trying to say is if we were to strip away the unnecessary stuff and just focus on maybe those objective factors in nature, if we are accepting that this definition is true, and that's a big if, then I think that's right. I think race falls into that. So now applying it to where we're at right now, when we're dealing with individuals in the law, in the legal system, should your skin color matter? And my answer is affirmatively and definitively no, because that's not what the law is intended to cover. If you look back through the history, the legislative proceedings, discussions going on, it was we don't care. There's no inherent difference. And so if you believe in equality, if then your skin color is not a relevant factor in determining what the outcome ought to be. That I think is universalism.
Yeah.
But that's not what we see in the activism today. And that's going to take some more time to unpack. And I know we're running out of time, but I
Well,
think go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that your closing thought there, I think is a good place to maybe kind of put a pause on it. If you have other things you want to say, we can absolutely talk about it. But seeing as how we're about to jump into kind of your intersectionality point, anyways, it might even be worth just picking up on that in the next one, unless you want to really kind of dive into.
No, I don't. I want to say I think there was one more thing. Let me just find it.
Okay.
Um uh yeah, moving away. Okay. So what I'm positing is until this activism started really with Derek Bell, this critical race theory, I think we were in a legal system that treated people equally under the law, regardless of skin color. The modern thinkers are saying that we should move away from that and towards identity-centered analysis. We should be, rather than treating them as individuals and focusing on, like what you said, merit, fairness, and equal protection, we should look at them as more of a social grouping, and showing that these groups have different experiences and trying to find justice for these groups that are going through things that other people are not. Um, I'm good to table it there. I think that there's a shift. I think we did a good job kind of explaining maybe where we're coming from and what I think actually is the way it ought to be, and that it is, and that there's this new realm that's kind of advocating for something else, and it's slippery. I think that's right. We'll cover that. So I'm good. I'm shutting up.
No, that's great. I think that's a great place. We'll dive in more into kind of, I know you want to talk more about kind of the activism part of it, kind of how they leverage some of these ideas and even in a way, I would say kind of twist some of the things that you've even talked about, some of the legal system becomes I think a point that that these things start to get twisted in an unintended manner. So I think that's great. Until next week, then.
Yeah.
See you.